Hello, everybody. Yesterday, we talked about the title of my new book, Look Into My Eyes, The Intersectionality of Identity. And we specifically talked about where the title came. But today, we're going to talk about something that often makes people uncomfortable. And it's a topic that Us Squared talks about a lot in a way that's very significant because it takes away some of that discomfort. Now, one of our core principles is that growth occurs in discomfort. And we know that sometimes these conversations can be uncomfortable. At the same time, we know that growth occurs in that discomfort. So the piece that really kind of causes some of that tinge of, ooh, I don't know, is often what we call the isms. Now, when we're thinking about isms, you might think of things like racism, classism, sexism, etc. But isms is that, and it's actually an acronym for what we're going to be talking about. And the acronym is identities shaped through marginalization and strength. So ISMS, identities shaped through marginalization and strength. And sometimes these words like racism, classism, we dive into 15 of them in this book. The whole section is around isms. And within those 15, when people hear things like racism or sexism, it often can promote almost this sense of shame or guilt or even defensiveness. So the way we approach it and the way I talk about it in the book is specifically to help people understand how they can have these honest conversations with themselves and with others without that shame, guilt, or defensiveness. Because, like our core principle number one, we know that guilt, shame, and politeness are the glue that hold prejudice and stigma in place. The truth is that those isms that we'll talk about, those 15, are systems, right? They're not just individual actions. Now, we talk about in the book as well how sometimes it can be individual as well, like implicit and explicit bias is individual, where systemic or systematic bias are more systems based or large scale. We know that these isms shape how society distributes opportunity, power, access. And in the book, I have specific examples of how it does that. And that's where privilege and oppression come in. So I just said another word that can be a trigger. This whole live is full of those words that in society, especially right now with our divisive social climate, are pretty triggering to some. And I recognize that privilege, in and of itself, just the word privilege, is very polarizing. It can be cause some defensiveness. It can cause people to kind of raise up and either push away from the conversation or get riled up in the conversation. I want to talk about this a little bit differently because we know that when people push away from a conversation, they're not going to gain anything from that. So we need to be able to have conversations around the isms without people feeling defensive or pushing away. I'm also sharing in the book some examples that maybe you hadn't even considered. Because when we can have those open conversations about both privilege and marginalization, so those opportunities where you have access to more opportunities, such as privilege, and also those instances or those policies that are in place to marginalize or to take away those opportunities. But when we're able to have those open, honest conversations, we become a more empathetic society. So I talk a lot about empathy throughout all of the work I do. But hopefully, when you read the book, you'll see how empathy is infused in everything we do. It's not about being able to relate to everybody because we all have different lived experiences, but it's being willing to listen to someone else's experience and truly take the time to try to understand, even if you don't have those lived experiences yourself. So let me just give you the basic definition. Privilege in and of itself simply means unearned advantage. It's not something that you earned. So when we hear things like, I worked really hard to get where I'm at, that's not necessarily the privilege in and of itself. What might be the privilege is the access to opportunities you had to help you get to where you are today. It does not take away that you did work really hard. I believe, myself included, that I worked very hard to get to where I'm at in society today. And I recognize that even though I worked really hard, there were also some privileges that I was afforded, not because I asked for them, but simply because of how society views me. It basically means that there were certain barriers that I did not have to overcome. Being a white presenting person, there were certain barriers that I did not have to overcome that my son, who is a black male, does have to work through. Or being black in America, there are some obstacles that he has to face that I do not have to face being white presenting. So, some other examples, and these are the things I want us to think about again, without the shame, without the blame. I don't want anyone to feel bad about having these privileges in society. They are embedded in our societal structure. What we want to do is be able to recognize those so that we can use our voice and our privilege to support those and provide access to opportunities to those who do not have that same privilege. So, another example you see if you're watching this on a screen where you can see my Zoom name, I have my pronouns. A cisgender person rarely has to explain their gender identity. If I didn't have she, her in my pronouns or there, you wouldn't confuse me for a male. I don't have a masculine presence. I don't identify as a man, and I was not assigned male at birth. I am a cisgender woman. I have cisgender privilege because I don't have to use my pronouns if I don't want to. I don't get misgendered. However, I do it, and I get asked this question a lot. I do it so that anyone in the room who does share their pronouns, who might not be cisgender, who might get misgendered from time to time, or often even, that they are not the only ones in the room who put their pronouns in the chat or in their signature line. I am using my privilege as a cisgender woman to amplify the need for us to talk openly around pronouns so that people who are not cisgender are not alone in that process. So, just a simple example, and that's a question I get a lot of Megan. Of course, you're a woman. Why do you put she, her everywhere? It's important to stand in solidarity and to stand up so that people who are not cisgender are not alone. Another example of privilege is a heterosexual person rarely has to have that uncomfortable moment with their family or their friends of coming out. It's assumed in society in many cases that someone is heterosexual. That is a privilege if you are heterosexual. If you are having to come out to your family, to your friends, then you are having to deal with an obstacle that was placed within our society. So, again, just a couple examples. Again, not to make anyone feel bad, not to put any shame or blame out there, but to give some real life classic examples of how privilege might show up. So, on the other side, oppression or marginalization is the other side, right? So, there's a difference between oppression and marginalization. Marginalization is typically exhibited by individuals. So, in my book, in section 1, I talk about the cycle of bias. And in that cycle of bias, we talk about implicit and explicit bias. That's marginalization that individuals put toward another group based on their personal biases. We also talk about the different types of biases, like stereotype bias and affinity bias. There's so many to name. But we go into all of those in depth in the book. Oppression is not just an individual level. Oppression is when systems consistently limit access or they limit opportunity for certain groups. So oppression is more large scale, and we often see that at the systemic and systematic levels. So if you're following along with me, and this is a lot of information, I'm just giving you little nuggets because when you pick up the book, it'll have it all there. You can make all your notes, take all of your jotting down of what's important to you. But I want you to think about those 4 levels within the cycle of bias. We have implicit and explicit, those are at the individual level. And then we have systemic and systematic, those are at the larger level, societal level, right? Now, as I just shared in the book, you'll be able to take notes and things, but also in honor of the format that I believe is so critical with any kind of book like this, just like our name says, Understand Self, Unite Society, as the founder of Us Squared, I believe very strongly in the power of reflection and self awareness. Self reflection is critical. So, just like my first book, Metamorphosis from Savior to Changemaker, I wrote in this book journal prompts as well. So you'll see journal prompts after every chapter. So to give you a couple that just to think on, they're also in the book. But the first one is, where in your life have you experienced privilege? So I want to put this out there because I truly believe that every single person in our society, regardless of your identities, has experienced at least one form of privilege. In the, gosh, I've been doing this for a really long time, probably close to over 30 years. I've been doing this work. And I have never met anyone. And I'm going to specifically speak about the last 10 years because Us Squared is celebrating our 10-year anniversary this year. So just since doing Us Squared as my full-time career, just in starting Us Squared, I've been more explicit in having these conversations with people. I have never met someone who does not have at least one identity of privilege. Never. Every single person that I have met, and I've met millions of people, whether it is in one-off conferences, whether it's in long-term coaching, just in my networking, I've never met anyone who has not experienced at least one identity of privilege. On the other side, when we're talking about areas or identities of marginalization or oppression, remember at the individual or systems-based level, I've only met one person in my entire career that we could not, I've tried, we could not identify an identity of marginalization. So out of all of those people, and I still stand strong in this, every single person has at least one identity of privilege and one identity of marginalization or oppression, except for that one person. So when I think about this, I want you to reflect also, what are your two identities? What is an identity that you have an area of societal privilege in? It does not mean that you have had a privileged life. I want to make that differentiation as well. It means that there were certain barriers you did not have to overcome because of that specific identity. On the flip side, what identities or areas have you experienced marginalization or societal oppression because of? Okay. So those two pieces I want you to think on. And that right there, understanding how we have all of these different identities and how those identities impact how we communicate with others and how society or others communicate with us. That right there is why intersectionality matters. And that's why this book is so special to me, because we're talking about why the intersectionality of identity matters. And it gives all of us a platform to be able to learn and lean into the conversation. Because remember, if people get defensive and push away from the conversation, yourself included, you're not going to learn and you're not going to be part of that change that you see on my wall, the change that we wish to see in the world. We need to be able to be a part of that conversation. So yesterday I talked about the title. Today I talked about a lot of the information and the data that was pulled for the book. Tomorrow, I'm going to shift from systems to something a lot more personal. So tomorrow, I'm going to share one of the most proud moments I had when writing the book, Look Into My Eyes, Intersectionality of Identity. There were a lot of moments of deep self-reflection throughout this book. I practice what I teach, right? And there were some moments of extreme pride, and there were also some moments of difficulty. And tomorrow, I'm going to share one of those moments of pride. So thank you so much for joining us today. See us tomorrow. Let me look at the time really quick. You know, now that we're on all these screens, we have way too many things going on. But tomorrow's live is going to be at 2 p.m. Eastern. We're trying to move them around the day a little bit so we can get people to join us. But 2 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, I'm going to talk about one of my most proud moments from the book. Hope to see you there. Thank you so much for joining.